Today on Reimagining Company Culture, we're welcoming our guest, Ed Jaffe, founder and lead coach of Demo Solutions. Hey, Ed, how's your day going?
I'm great. How are you, Christina?
I'm good. It's the beginning of the week, so start fresh. It's a nice spring day outside, like we were talking about. I would love to jump in if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, pronouns, and the work you do at Demo Solutions.
Sure. So pronouns are he, his, him. And my role at Demo Solutions, I'm the founder and as well as the lead coach and consultant. We work with companies, primarily tech companies, to help them get better at demos and presentations and have better conversations and connections with the audiences.
Amazing. And why did you kind of start Demo Solutions?
So about 2.5 years ago or so, I was in a situation. I got laid off about 4 months before my son was born.
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew I wasn't going to get paternity anywhere and said, I've been doing this for a long time. Might as well just throw up a shingle and see what happens. And here we are still doing it. So it's worked out better than I could have expected.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really great. And also one of the things that we had talked about as well was during specifically the sales process, the importance of psychological safety and what role that plays there. Could you tell us a little bit more about your philosophy with psychological safety in the sales process?
Absolutely. So I've spent a lot of time in what's a pre-sales role, which is essentially, for those not familiar with that, it's the sort of the consultant that works alongside the account executive. So in a sales environment, you may have somebody kind of leading the account. That's typically what the executive role does. In companies that have a pre-sales org, not everybody has them, but in the ones that do, our role is typically to work sort of alongside that person, doing the demos and presentations, understanding customer requirements. Often I play good cop to the salesperson's bad cop, so they can focus on all the salesy stuff, and I can just be like, I'm just here to help. And so it definitely helps with that role. And so I have thought a lot about psychological safety in this context because I found that a lot of sales environments just don't help create that. And often the most obvious place where you see it is in discovery findings. So again, for people without a sales background, often what happens is you have what's called discovery process, which is the salesperson or whoever's involved will go and ask a bunch of questions to understand what the client's situation is and if they can sell them something, what they can sell them. Often after they do that, when they come back to do a demo or sort of a second or third meeting, they'll say, okay, in discovery, we learned all of this stuff. And that tends to be a bit unsafe in terms of how they deliver it. And so what I mean is they'll often try to, quote, challenge the customer, or they'll say things like, okay, so in discovery, we learned none of your systems are integrated. Nobody's even talking to each other. How do you even have a job? Okay, it might be a bit hyperbolic, but that's basically how it comes off, is they end up like throwing somebody under the bus in front of their boss to be like, yeah, you're doing a terrible job, but don't worry, I've known you for like 10 minutes and I'm going to fix all of your problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, how can you really engage them in a conversation to make sure that you are delivering this in a safe way while also showcasing, for a salesperson that, maybe the technology or whatever they're offering might help them with these challenges and maybe reframing it in that way?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think a lot about how can we start with the questions that we're asking. And I think about, there's a concept called motivational interviewing, which is basically, it comes out of substance abuse. And how you treat that, which is you're trying to get somebody to sort of see a discrepancy when they're being a bit ambivalent. So it's this idea of, well, I need to stop drinking, but I don't really want to. And you can kind of take the same thing, because in sales, when you're selling software, you're essentially trying to get somebody past this fear of change, because change is really scary.
Yeah.
And especially if things are working in your current environment, yeah, they might not be great, but you know how to do it. And once somebody comes in with this new thing, that could mean you're fired because you don't know this new system, or it turns out they're going to automate somebody out of a job. And so you have to get past that, a similar fear of, how do I know I need to change this, but I don't really want to. And so you can ask a lot of questions that kind of get somebody to see that. And a really powerful way to do that is with reflective listening, which is something Chris Voss, for anyone who's read Never Split the Difference, calls tactical empathy, which is way cooler than reflective listening. But it's where you're starting to reflect someone's emotions back to them. So instead of this process is terrible, I can see you're a bit frustrated with this process, and here's why. And so you can start to play back what you're hearing, but really focus on the emotions, not the situation, because that's ultimately what's driving us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the sales process as well, there's a lot of kind of getting someone to buy into that change, but also building trust as well, especially if you are doing, you're in the process of a consultative sale and it's a two-way conversation. And in this process, you don't really know the person. Like you said, it could be 10 minutes, it could be 3 or 4 meetings. Do you think that there's a difference between building trust externally with potential clients as opposed to your internal team who you might talk to more often and you might have norms with them? What are your thoughts there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that when you're in a culture, you get a sense of what that is and what the appropriate behaviors are, or at least you're supposed to. Though sometimes I found the companies that talk the most about culture are the ones that tend to have the worst culture. So the ones that where people are just kind of in it and living it tend to be the ones where they're more comfortable there. But you definitely can be more comfortable with your peers and work on sort of the game plan with them. I think when you're in front of a customer, there's this idea in sales that you can just go in and show empathy. And I see a lot of content about this. So like you go on LinkedIn and all these people like go in with empathy and show empathy, but you can't do that because if you think about at its core, empathy is the ability to walk in someone else's shoes. I can't do that if I haven't asked you questions, if I haven't gotten to know you. And so a lot of times I think that people think they can just walk in and like do this magic rapport building and just start to be like, oh, don't worry. Like I get this, but no, anyone who's been in a long-term relationship knows the second you say, I get this, you're probably wrong. So you really need to start to get to know somebody before you can just start saying things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to build that foundation as well and not just go in with those assumptions too.
Exactly. And it is easy to go in with assumptions because you do end up seeing similar things over and over again. And a lot of my work as a demo coach, a lot of the mistakes are the things I see in demos that people are doing. They tend to be similar and because we all kind of do these things for the same reasons. And they're things that I used to do before I learned sort of the right way to do some of these things. But if I go in and just assume that you're going to do all the things that I typically see, that's going to cloud my perception of it. It may make me pay attention less, which is not something that I want to do. And so I have to be able to leave all those assumptions out and just kind of take a look at what I'm seeing in the situation. Because otherwise I'm going to fail in my role. And I'm not going to give you the best advice I can because I'm just going to sort of treat it like any other situation, which may not be the case.
Yeah, and you definitely want to go in with an open mind and also being present in the conversation, not just going through a script or going through the motions, like most things in life in general, I would say as well. And a big part of the demo and especially the initial conversation is actually showing the product or service to the potential client. I would love to ask as well in terms of an inclusive demo. I know before this we were talking about things like the presentation and asking questions of how you can really make it intentional and inclusive instead of another sales demo that they might be seeing. Can you talk a little bit about how folks can think about intentionally doing that?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that kind of goes into that question. So as we think about just the presentation itself, and then we kind of work backwards to some of the discovery process. But within the presentation, I started thinking about inclusive demos a few years ago because somebody called me out, and rightfully so, where the deck that I was using, I love to use pop culture and GIFs and memes, all this fun stuff.
Me too.
We all do. They're fun. But something that I didn't really think about was that the things that resonate with me from a cultural perspective may not with others in the audience. And so what I got called out for was it was all white men. And those were all the references I had. So it was like a Godfather reference and an Office reference and things that most people I'm presenting to know, but not everybody does. And it's very sort of, it looks like a very specific thing. It was all white men. Like you just don't see any diversity there. And so I started thinking about how can I be more inclusive with my own content as I'm in front of audiences. And I think there's a few ways to think about it. And something that I have a partner who I work with on DEI stuff. And so he spent some time working with me to figure out like one of the things he said, and this totally blew my mind was, do you have a picture of someone in a wheelchair? And that's not the context of the picture. And I'm not even sure I do. And I try to think about this stuff. And so in a lot of times where people just try to be diverse, they just try to find pictures of people who just look different. And that's not really to me what it's about. It's can you take it further? It's think about, are you unintentionally reinforcing stereotypes? So if you have, think about what stereotypes might fit the person that you're showing. And if that is reinforcing it, maybe find another picture that doesn't do that. And so I try to think about, am I unintentionally reinforcing stereotypes? Am I not? And so it goes beyond just, are there people who look different? But if the stereotypes are being reinforced, and sometimes you need a third party to tell you that, that's something that you should probably think about adjusting in the presentation. The other thing too, is if you think about references that again, like The Office, take that. Like I think most people I know have seen The Office, but
Yeah.
not everybody necessarily. And when you make somebody uncomfortable or you talk about something they don't know, they're not going to tell you that they don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
There's actually, I'm sorry, God.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you.
So there's this idea called pluralistic ignorance, which is basically if I don't understand what you're talking about, but nobody else is asking any questions, I think I'm the stupid one. And I may be the only one who doesn't know, but nobody may know, and no one's gonna ask questions because we all think we're the dumb one, and we don't want to like look stupid in front of our peers. And so I didn't really think about that as much when I did a lot of the old references. Was if do people understand these references? Do they get it? Like I love Arrested Development. I've seen every episode, at least of the first 3 seasons, more times than I can count. But not everybody. That's a bit esoteric for a lot of audiences. So I have to be careful how I'm using those. And so one of the rules that I have now with any reference is, will the content hold up if you don't understand the reference? So if there's a meme and the meaning of it is obvious and it's not reinforcing stereotypes, even if you don't know like the source material, but you can kind of get, okay, like Michael Scott looks mad and it's the no or something like that. Like
Yeah.
you get it, even if you don't know the character and understand it. So that's been one of my rules is if you can understand the point of it, but not the reference, that's okay. Cause you won't feel excluded at that point. You'll still understand what's going on, even if the reference isn't necessarily landing. And then the other piece of this too is just it's language. And so a really obvious one is you guys, which is typically, I know we use that sort of without putting gender on it, but what I found is that by eliminating that, it does make audiences more comfortable, particularly in tech where you tend to have a higher male to female ratio. So not everybody in the audience is a guy, or you just don't know how people identify. You may think one thing, but we should leave those assumptions out. So you may be saying guys, and that just ends up reinforcing what somebody is often misgendered. And so I don't want to be the one to do that or put myself in that situation. So think about folks, all, team, the name of the team, somebody's name. Names can be really powerful. So using somebody's name instead of just a generic pronoun can work a lot better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good point too, because we're not only talking about inclusive demos, we're talking about inclusive design in your product, but also inclusive language, which is something we have actually discussed at AllVoices just the other day as well, in terms of when you're talking about for engineering, like orphan pages, when you're saying blind spots, it's just these things that have been common phrases in our kind of vocabulary. But if you are someone who is blind, or if you're not a guy, you do pick up on these things and you hear it, and it does kind of separate you from the audience. And it's something that is really important. So I appreciate that point. And I want to go back to something you said earlier in terms of that presentation, where someone said, I just wanted to flag for you that all the folks in your presentation are white men. That's a part of feedback. And for some folks who would hear that, they would be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry about that. And just have this kind of uncomfortableness with this feedback. But we all know that feedback is important to level up, both giving it and getting it. And I know you've written many blog posts and have experience with overcoming a fear of feedback. So I would love to ask kind of how you adapt to this constructive feedback as the person who is receiving it first.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question as we think about how to give feedback. And I think about organizations where I've been in where they kind of I think sometimes people may read like the first chapter of a book and then just adopt whatever they think it is. So that's where I've seen a lot of people saying like radical candor, and then they just end up using as a cover to be mean. And so I think there's a couple things that I try to do when I'm giving feedbacks. As a coach, that's where I spend a lot of time. The first thing is finding a way to let the audience off the hook. And so I don't want to make people feel bad. And oftentimes I think that there's this tendency to sort of really go after it with the feedback. And even if it comes from a place of wanting to help, if you just start like tearing someone down, they're not going to feel good about that. And so oftentimes when I'm giving a piece of feedback, I'll either say, I'll acknowledge like, this is something I used to do, and here's why. Like I see what you're trying to get across. So I'm showing somebody that I see them and I understand what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
But here's maybe why it didn't work. I don't necessarily tell them what they should do, because that's not often my job. Like anyone who says like, if I were you, I'm not you. So I can't tell you necessarily everything to do, but I can kind of give you some thoughts about why it's not working. And then we can talk about how to adapt it from there. So every piece of feedback always has a rationale, here's the psychology behind why this isn't landing. And that way I'm not making them feel bad about it, because it's not necessarily something that people would know. And it's really coming from a place of I'm here to help you and not from a place of just I'm going to give you a bunch of feedback. I think there's also this idea with feedback of if you think about consent, and I'm using that word very deliberately. I recently did an interview with somebody who she does addiction counseling as well as sex and relationship work. And she used that word, and we talked about that a lot, about how like it does have a lot of connotations, but it still holds up because the idea is I need to make sure it's not just permission. And that's kind of the word I used to use, but it really is, I need to know it's okay with you to give you some feedback. I've been in environments where someone will just walk in and say, I'm going to give you some feedback. And the second they said that, it was going to be bad. It was never, I'm going to give you feedback. You did a great job in that meeting. Because it was like, I'm going to give you some feedback. That was terrible. And the other thing you can think about too is once I have your consent to give you that feedback, and it's the same as any other way of finding consent. I can either sort of try to pick up on signs, or at some point I can ask you, hey, I appreciate everything we've been talking about. Is it okay if I just give you some thoughts that I have, and actually make sure it's okay before I just start going? But the other question that you can ask yourself when giving feedback is, who am I giving this feedback for? And this one took me a while to really wrap my head around this idea. But if you're giving the feedback for yourself because you just want to say something, then you probably shouldn't say it. And if you're saying it for the audience, then it's okay to say it. And so it's something that I will ask myself before giving almost any piece of feedback, because when you're trying to say something for yourself, like you may sort of take it on that tangent a little bit where you just really want to say something to show that you know this thing, but that's usually just to make yourself feel good, not necessarily for the audience.
Absolutely. There is that kind of intentionality behind this as well, in terms of I'm not just going to say something to say something, or because I'm your manager, or because I'm your teammate and I've been here for X number of years longer than you have, so I have this institutional knowledge. It's really, okay, am I going to help them better their performance? Is this something that will really be helpful? And also, again, it's a two-way conversation. It's not just someone speaking at another person just for the sake of saying empty words.
Exactly.
And one of the things that I saw in one of your articles was talking about nonviolent communication. And that's something that I've actually learned over the past year. Can you tell folks a little bit about nonviolent communication and how that really manifests in giving and receiving feedback?
Yeah, I think it really goes to having a lot of that empathy when you're giving feedback, and try to find a lot of it. And I know I'm not getting the right psychological definition of this, but it's really just showing someone that you see them and that you understand. The empathy piece is tied really closely to it.
Yeah.
And so it's changing a lot of the language from the aggressive language that people tend to use and getting towards a little bit more compassionate language. And so you think about words that you can use, or it's kind of funny. I joke a lot that salespeople should watch a lot more Daniel Tiger. I have a 2-year-old and we spend a lot of time watching Daniel Tiger, but it's a lot of that same idea. If you think about it, I love what the Big Little Feelings people are doing. Are you familiar with them?
I'm actually not.
So they put a lot of really great content out about how to talk to toddlers. And a lot of it is basically the same as what you want to do with adults. It's, I see you're really frustrated. I understand it can be frustrating when dad says no. And so you're validating them. You're showing them like you understand them, but they're not going to get what they want, but you understand them. And I think that's a real key piece of all of this, is showing people that you see them, because we all just want to be seen.
Absolutely. And I think that also goes to the piece of, the story that you're telling yourself and the story that you see others, manifesting out there into the universe, seeing it that is aligned. Oftentimes, I would argue it's not, because everybody has their own perceptions of things, and getting on that same page and really communicating empathetically and effectively is really important, especially when you are in a workplace and you're all working towards a similar goal, but each of you has different ways of doing that because you're on different teams. And I know you just spoke about kind of thinking about feedback in terms of who you're giving it to. Do you think there is a different way to kind of manage up and give feedback to managers or leaders in an organization, as opposed to a team member who's also an individual contributor? And, just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think all feedback comes down to understanding the audience. And so if you're managing up, you may just get more resistance, and you have to adapt a little bit to know that you're going to get that resistance. But I think it does come back to that, showing someone that you see them, that you kind of understand. And if you just say like, this isn't going to work, that like, how many managers want to hear that? Or especially if like it's their baby, they like love this idea. But if you can find a way to kind of acknowledge what they're trying to do, and then maybe give your feedback that way, instead of just oh yeah, this is bad. Like that's obviously not going to work. So it really comes down to it's the same thing. I don't know if I know probably should change based on managing up, but I think a lot of it comes down, it's the same rules to even with who you're giving it to. It's you think about the power structure. So I think when it's somebody who's maybe a peer or subordinate, people tend to almost go farther because they have that ability to do so, versus with managers. I think one of the big things is you have to pick and choose even more than with a subordinate. But something that I think about when I'm giving feedback to anybody is sort of triaging it and think about what is the most important piece of feedback and what is the least important piece of feedback, and then watching how they take it. So managers, you're probably going to get less that you can give them before they start to react to it. With people who may be subordinate, they just may not show you their emotions behind it, whereas managers will feel more comfortable. But you still can look for when someone is we call it the idea of being coached out, where I kind of look for maybe your eyes are starting to narrow a little bit, your body language is changing, maybe you're kind of leaning back or you kind of start crossing your arms. It's very clear that I've kind of hit the wall with how much further I can go. And that's where I have to know, okay, it's time for me to back off, because we're not going to get anywhere if I keep going with this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think body language is something that is really important too. And when, especially in this more virtual world, when you're on Zoom giving feedback, if you do have the ability to turn on your camera and just, see the tone and facial expressions, I think that's also something that's important. I know we haven't talked about this before, but I would love to know, is there anything that comes to mind when you think of the best and worst feedback you've ever gotten?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know if it's funny. I don't remember the exact feedback itself. I think about more how I felt when getting the feedback, because that's, I think, what people remember, sort of the emotional way that it was given to you. And I think I'm thinking about one company in particular where all of the feedback was almost always negative. And I think it's almost, as I think about that word, like a lot of times when I'm giving feedback as a coach, people will be like, okay, like I want the negative. And it's like, it's really not. It really is constructive, but it's coming from a place of being constructive. I think I've been in environments where people just give negative feedback to give feedback. So I can actually think of one in particular where I worked with someone he used to manage was on my team. And so he pulled me aside to be like, I didn't like how you managed her. And I actually talked to her about the situation. I was like, I want to make sure I didn't do anything wrong. And she just kind of stared at me with I have no idea what you're talking about right now. So I think that was one of the situations where maybe it didn't work for his style, but that worked for me. So I think he was almost maybe transferring a little bit or, projecting a little bit like how he was feeling on to me. So I think that was probably the worst. And thinking about the best, I can think about one person in particular who I work with now quite a bit. And the way she gives feedback is she kind of does a lot of the motivational interviewing stuff I was talking about, where she never just will say here's what I think. It's much more, what do you think? And she knows where I'm going to go. And I think she also knows me well enough to know where I'm going to go, but she's able to kind of just ask those questions and help me get to that conclusion, which then I'll internalize it a lot more because it's me getting there versus you telling me. I think that goes back to a lot of that's the discovery stuff we were talking about earlier, is if I can ask questions to kind of get you to the conclusion where I'm trying to get you to go and help you see that discrepancy, I think that's a lot more powerful than if I just walk in and say, yeah, you're terrible at this. That's just going to immediately make somebody shut down.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. And that's interesting too about the person who gave you feedback about someone you were managing as well. And also doing it in a way that it wasn't in front of the other person. It's just there are different ways. You don't have to give it right in that setting to give feedback as well. There are different opportunities to do that, but that's interesting.
And I wasn't ready for it as well. Like some of the other things I was talking about earlier, consent, and that was with that environment, that particular company, that was all the feedback tended to just be someone walk in, like I said earlier, just, I'm going to give you feedback. And it wasn't, can I? And even if they said, can I, it's sort of in that way that it's sort of when my mom asks if she can have one of the French fries off my plate when she's already taken it off the plate and then asks, it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to be ready to have that conversation, and nobody likes being caught off guard with that as well, especially at work. So having that rapport, and maybe setting aside time on someone's calendar to do so as well, to give them a heads up of, hey, this is something that we want to discuss, or just I wanted to share this with you. Let me know your thoughts, and just get it. Waiting for the answer. Definitely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and what ends up happening is it's your body doesn't understand the difference between an emotional threat and a physical threat. We still have the same, all the reactions of attention narrowing and changes in like your heart starts beating faster, hormone releases, all that stuff is happening because your body's preparing to be like attacked by a bear, which that's probably something that doesn't happen at work, though maybe in your line of work that does. I don't know. It's not anything that's ever happened to me.
Yeah.
But when somebody does that, your body's having the same reaction because it really doesn't know that it's an emotional threat instead of a physical one. And so if you see when someone's giving feedback and the other person is sort of, and I would do this where you just kind of like shrink back or shut down because someone's catching you off guard. You're not in a place to hear it. And that's why that consent is so important, because that helps avoid that shutting down, because I know it's okay to do it instead of just like, I'm going to say this thing. I didn't like that thing you said. It's like, okay.
Okay, why didn't you like it? What can I do better? Is there, a way that we can move forward in this? Why are you sharing this with me? What place are you in? Yeah.
Sometimes it's just people saying stuff because they want to say stuff. It does go back to that particular feedback I was talking about earlier. He clearly just wanted to say it, and it really didn't have a whole lot to do with me. And it wasn't really meant for me. It just was something that he felt like saying. And I think that's often what happens with that feedback is when you're just saying stuff because it's like the first thing that pops into your head. I think when really giving feedback, you have to think about what is the person on the other end of this going to feel when I say this. Mm-hmm. And that's that point I made earlier about, I remember more the emotion than the actual feedback, because that's how we walk away with things is we remember how somebody made us feel. It's that it's a bit of a cliche, but the Maya Angelou quote about how you remember how people make us feel. It's true. That's the thing that people really walk away with. And it ends up really, our memories will actually change based on that emotion. And so there's this concept, it's called, I'm a big behavioral economics nerd.
I can tell.
Yeah, I'm a big Dan Kahneman fan. And so there's this concept in there called the Rashomon effect, which for those not familiar with the movie Rashomon, it was sort of, if anybody's ever seen that TV trope where you'll have the same story told from 4 different characters' perspectives.
Yes.
Rashomon was the first movie to do it. It's a Kurosawa movie. I want to say it's from the 50s. And so it was this same story where there are a couple events that happened, but every version of it like basically makes a different person the hero of it, because we're all the heroes of our own stories. Mm-hmm. And so it's the same thing where you and I could be in the same meeting and I'm really upset and you're not. We'll walk out of that meeting and you'll be like, that was a great meeting. What are you talking about? That was terrible. And it's all based on how we're emotionally processing it.
Yeah, I think we all bring in different perspectives and also different experiences, whether it's with the other folks in the meeting or it's something in our personal lives as well. We're in a world where our personal and professional lives, we're in each other's homes right now. So it's all melding into one. So I think that's also really important to keep in mind too, for the future of work, the future of giving feedback and connecting with people in your workplace who you might not be meeting in person and have that face-to-face time, or as much as you would pre-pandemic as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. You never know what people are going through. I was in a situation a few years ago where I was doing some demo coaching and the person presenting, he was trying to make a joke about like when you Google stuff, Google will always Google like medical stuff, like just don't ask Dr. Google anything. And made a comment about, you Google, you have a headache. And it turns out like Google says you have cancer, something like that. And it was not there was a cancer survivor in the audience, and it was, and I understood what he was trying to do. Right. It just was not the best. And so that's something else. If you think about when you're interacting with somebody, you never know what someone's going through. I think about that a lot right now, actually, because of people talking about the pandemic in their presentations. And almost everybody does it now, where the world has changed. And then I've seen it where people actually have like pictures of people in clean suits and like hazmat outfits. And it's one of those things where I'm like, we all have this context. Like there's been no probably greater shared trauma than any of us have experienced in the past, say 20 years. So we all understand what this is. And so when people start reinforcing that, you also don't know how the audience has dealt with that, like how it's impacted the person. Like I've lost family to it. And so like, I'm able to like distance myself as a coach from that. Like I never have that reaction to it, but you never know if the audience has. And so when we say things like that, now you're getting somebody thinking about their family and you're putting them in a really bad place emotionally, but then you're going to try to sell them something. So, and usually it's one of those things people just say to say. And so you want to really think about, especially now more than ever, what might the audience be going through and can you adjust based on that?
Yeah, again, not saying something to say something where it's like, oh, we have to acknowledge the pandemic at the top of the email, at the top of the call. Again, when we have a second call with the same folks
Yep.
on the line. Yeah, I think it makes sense to really tailor your presentation to the current time period that we're in, and also being wary. And it goes to being aware too, empathetically listening. And just at the end of the day, nobody knows what anyone else is going through. So I
Exactly.
appreciate that comment. Are there any other, for going back to that discovery and kind of initial conversation, for if you are working at a company where it's software as a service or SaaS, where you are, there are a ton of demos out there. Are there any other misconceptions that folks do either in the presentation or in the call, in the conversation, that, you want to kind of squash right now?
I wish I could squash every NASCAR slide that's ever happened. And for that, I know when I make that reference, actually, I work with international audiences who don't know what I'm talking about. So for those who don't, the NASCAR slide is sort of that slide with all the logos on it, kind of like a car in a NASCAR race that just has logos everywhere. That slide is the bane of my existence because audiences do not care. And that's really the first. I'm being a little extreme on this, but I think that if you look at the first about 10 minutes of almost every sales meeting, they tend to be wasted because they tend to be either, let's talk about ourselves for 10 minutes, which I try to avoid that as much as possible because, again, no one cares. I want to make it about the audience. But people often will show that because they, quote, want credibility. But I find that the more you talk about yourself, the less credibility you end up having. And so instead of showing a bunch of slides, or a bunch of logos, what works really well is talk about one customer and talk about that story and what did that customer approach you for and what did you end up doing? And if you can actually save the result until the end to build a little bit of curiosity and have a story, that works incredibly well. Because now it's the same thing as you're humanizing it. Yes, it's a company, but it's the same idea that you're putting sort of a face to this story versus here's a bunch of logos. And I think the other problem that happens, and I see this a lot when I'm doing what I call a demo audit, where I'm actually watching some live demos or some gong recordings and giving feedback based on customer interactions, is I see so many times people will show that slide, but then they'll say something like, well, we work with a lot of other companies too, because they show the big names. So you'll see like Fortune 500s up there, which that company may work with, but they'll show that when presenting to like someone in the small or medium business segment. And so if you see like Coca-Cola up there, well, I'm like a 30-person company. How are you going to work with me? Right. And it's this kind of, is this idea, and I see people just asking that. And so sometimes I'll see salespeople try to get ahead of that, where they'll make that comment before showing the slide. But then why show the slide at all? The other thing that I see too is they'll say, we're just going to get through this content for the sake of time. And they'll kind of go like rush that first 10 minutes. But when we do that, you're basically saying to the audience, I know this isn't worth spending either of us spending time on it, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely have seen that in previous presentations, and I can definitely, relate to that feeling as well, in terms of, okay, this is amazing, and just wanting it to relate to you as you're the person who's listening to it as well, or potentially trying to solve a problem within the organization too. So you do want to make it specific to the audience.
Exactly. And by doing that generic first 10 minutes, you're saying, this has nothing to do with you. It goes back to, I'm just saying this because I want to say it, or because marketing told me I was supposed to say it. But if you can use that first 10 minutes instead, ask questions, even if there's this idea often with discovery that it's supposed to be like an activity you check off, like you put in Salesforce, yep, I did the discovery, check, let's move to the next thing. But people know when you're doing that. They can feel it when you're just like asking questions off a list. They know that that's what's happening. And so they can like feel it, especially when you're trying to get sort of deal qualification. So there's this framework that a lot of salespeople use called BANT, budget, authority, need, time. Do you have the right people in the deal? Do they have money? But sometimes people will very aggressively ask those questions about who's the decision maker or who controls budget, but in a way that when it turns out somebody is not the decision maker, they make them feel really bad about that. Oh yeah, you're not important enough. Let me get to your boss. And yeah, I get it. You need to get to the person with money, but you don't want to make the person who's sort of lower in the organization feel bad about that. But that's what those questions can tend to do. The other thing I see often, and I know somebody's asking questions off a list, if you see a lot of why questions, which tend to make the audience very, very defensive. Because if I say why, I don't know, why are you doing anything? It just, there's no good answer to that question. And it just immediately puts people kind of on that defensive. And so as you think about the questions to ask, the advice I always give is it's sort of like those journalism questions, but replace why with how. So who, what, when, where, how. Any question that starts with that's going to be a good question, as long as you don't say why, and as long as you don't just try to get a yes or no answer. Because usually you just get these awkward, like, hey, do you have any questions? Okay. And then you just keep moving on because there's really nothing for the audience to say.
Right. Absolutely. One of the key insights from our conversation is don't just say something to say something. Why are you saying something in terms of feedback, in terms of a demo, in terms of the language that you're using as well? Great. Very important. The last question I have for you in our conversation today is there anything else that you would like to share to the folks who are listening to the call? And of course, how can people get in touch with you if they want to continue the conversation or learn more about demo solutions?
Absolutely. So the one thing I would say that I didn't really talk as much about earlier is we think about, we were talking about sort of the idea of inclusive demos and to think about product as well. So think about colors, as simple as that may sound. I see a lot of demos where somebody will say, well, you see here in red and you see here in green. Turns out that about 8% of men I think it's 1 in 8, was it 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women won't have any idea what you're talking about because they can't distinguish red from green.
Yeah.
And I see it in product design too. And so as you think about inclusive, it's not just necessarily the images or the language. It can be as simple as the colors. And so there are people who will kind of do audits for that. That's not something I necessarily do. I look for it, but there are organizations that do more accessibility, which is something I recommend. And as far as getting a hold of me, my site is demoswindeals.com, or I have all kinds of stuff on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn/Ed Jaffe. I've been on LinkedIn since 2007. So I got that before anybody else with my name could get it.
Wow.
So,
an early adopter. Nice humble brag there. Just kidding.
I mean, senior year of college, I thought it was something we were supposed to do. So, but definitely you can find me there on my site or Twitter @demoswindeals.
Amazing. Well, that's how we connected. So love to see it. And all of that information will be in the bio of this episode. Thank you so much for being a guest, Ed. We really appreciate it and hope to speak with you soon. At AllVoices, we believe in the empowerment of employees to speak up, and creating a place where employees feel they could speak up is a need to have in order for everyone to succeed. Ed, I'll see you on LinkedIn and internet.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.